Hi, everybody. Here we are in Loveland, Colorado.
And who are you?
And I'm Connie Baxter Marlow.
And I'm Andrew Cameron Bailey, and we're more commonly known as Connie and Andrew.
Connie and Andrew.
Or Andrew and Connie.
Or Andrew and Connie, depends if you're in climate or you're in consciousness or where you are, first 50 years. Yeah, and love is a key thread through this presentation we're going to be making. And so we're going to be speaking about Martin Luther King as a spiritual activist and how he saw the spiritual unfolding of the United States of America. And we're going to be bringing in the spiritual origins of this nation, the multicultural beginnings in Plymouth, Massachusetts, with the Mayflower Pilgrims, who were spiritual activists, and the Pokanoket Wampanoag Indians. So would you like to say a little something in this introduction? And then we've got a PowerPoint for you all, and it's going to be quite an educational process. So we're going to move right along.
So the overarching idea, as Connie said, is spiritual activism. What is that? And I'd like to ask the question, is spiritual activism perhaps the single most important thing that humanity is engaged in and has been engaged in for millennia? I would say that one of our best known spiritual activists in history would be Jesus himself 2,000 years ago, all the way up to, let's go to Henry David Thoreau, let's go to Martin Luther King today for sure. Let's go to John Lennon. So it takes many forms and can come through many different channels, not always in a church or in that sort of institutional context. Sometimes it's a pop culture thing, like John Lennon was able to get this extraordinary message through to so many in this brand new unfoldment that occurred.
So
I have a dream.
Martin Luther King had a dream.
We all have a dream, I do believe.
Yes, and what's it going to take to realize that dream that he had for the US of A? It's going to take each of us showing up and becoming what he dreamed we could be. And so let me see here. He says, let us not wallow in the valley of despair, which many people are feeling right now. I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Oops. Okay. So
can we get that? I think if you put that in
there, we go.
Oh, you got it out.
So we're going to speak on the spiritual origins of a yet to be great nation. And
meaning there's potential that has yet to be manifested in this experiment.
Exactly.
Human that's being really severely tested right now.
And we're going to be speaking about realizing the promise of the US of A, the liberty, justice, equality, and abundance for all that's embodied in that dream, that American dream that's been taking the shots at this point, because it's led to materialism and all that stuff, to an excess and inequality and the lack of liberty and justice and abundance for all. So it's a challenge we have ahead of us.
So here's a definition, if you will, of spiritual activism. Spiritual activism is the application of the higher beliefs of love and unity to change political and social systems, to bring peace and harmony to the world, and to awaken others to their own divinity. So
that's what the Mayflower Pilgrims dreamt of, that we could relate directly to the divine, and that's where we're headed. And here is Martin Luther King again. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
And that's Martin Luther King, just so everybody knows.
I have a dream speech.
Yeah.
And that's where we're headed. We're headed into higher frequencies. We're going to touch on that in our talk and show the evolution of consciousness that humanity is headed for, we're in process of. And here we have what we're really going to take you on a bit of an educational journey into the founding of this nation, the intercultural synthesis at the very beginnings that can inspire us to go forward into the future. And this is a picture of
the first Native American friend that the so-called Mayflower Pilgrims befriended, this native man they befriended, whose name was Tisquantum, they called him Squanto. And the most famous thing that he did, aside from all, and he also happened to have been in England prior, so spoke English, critical point. And one of the most important things he did, he showed the English how to plant Indian corn. And it was a completely different, something different from, they were very good farmers, but they had not come across this particular
Indian corn in the sandy
before.
soil of,
Right.
of Plymouth.
Had to do with fish, these little, very common little fish that really fertilize the soil.
Yeah, so we have to keep moving right along.
Okay.
So we're speaking of humanity on an evolutionary upward spiral to peace on earth. And that's where we're going to take you on this journey. So what now? I wrote this in 1995. I've been at this for a while, and I've been bringing Martin Luther King in as an exemplar of this higher vision for decades. And I wrote, when we come together as equals, as family, and we each open our hearts and our minds to the other, the melding of our gifts will bring a new perspective that is invisible at this time. This new perspective will allow us to see the path to true unity, peace, and freedom, which is what Martin was talking about with the valleys being made and the mountains disappearing, because we're going into another reality, a higher way of being.
And here's a prophecy from the Hopi. When birds fall from the sky and the animals are dying, a new tribe of people shall come unto the earth from many colors, classes, and creeds, who by their actions and deeds shall make the earth green again. They will be known as the warriors of the rainbow. That would be us.
That would be us. And Martin says, this will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So we're speaking of an evolutionary leap, and that involves healing personal and ancestral trauma, which is going on globally right now, which is a messy business, but so important. And that'll lead us to a higher way of seeing as we access our hearts, our armored hearts that have been wounded and have been dealing with a world out of balance forever. And we move into trust, we move into oneness, we open our hearts, and we bring peace on earth and heaven to earth together, as Martin was speaking. So Martin says,
well, look at this quote over here. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I love that. Wow. Yeah, love brings about miracles. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men and women.
Yes, Martin, the love method. So what is going on here? So we're going to take a track from the 1500s. So we bring you into the founding of this nation. And this, we're going to move through this very quickly. So do you want to just run through that, Andrew? Because that's your arena. Andrew's our science guy.
Science guy. Well, this is more history than science, don't you think? We do have science emerging and challenging the church. Okay, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, we had Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton. We had this rational left brain science, hard science phenomenon emerge for the first time in human history, to my knowledge. And it challenged everything the church was saying. Prior to that time, the church had basically told people what to think and what to believe. And all of a sudden, here's something completely different coming in from left field. And one of the things, and Descartes is probably very responsible for that, is the idea of humanity as separate from nature and separate from the divine, triggering a split in the human psyche. All of a sudden, we have fear, separation, scarcity versus trust and unity. And the idea of individualism, was that a new phenomenon back then? Individualism in the context of the materialist reductionist paradigm, leading to materialism and domination, the world that we have been witnessing for the last 400 years odd.
Yeah. And so we're going to move from monarchy to democracy, the innate desire to be free. And Martin was always talking about freedom. And this is a key track and very important for us to understand.
So think about monarchy back at the time of the Mayflower Pilgrims. It was certainly in Europe, and I think in China and India and places like that, major cultures, it was all about absolute monarchy and then the masses of the people, with very few people in between. And, you know, it was probably believed that God created us that way, and that certainly served the rulers. However, that was about to come to an end, and this brand new phenomenon, democracy, was just beginning.
And we have the Magna Carta in 1215 was the very beginning in England, a charter of liberties that only lasted a very short time, but very key principles carried on. And in 1290, around that time, the Iroquois Great Law, participatory democracy, came to the Americas, to North America. And the Scrooby Covenant in 1606 was written by the Mayflower Pilgrims as they gathered in their treasonous way. And we'll go into that. And then there was the Mayflower Compact in 1620, drafted by the Pilgrims before landing here. And then the United States Constitution. So that's a little bit of a timeline. And here's the Scrooby Covenant.
And so Connie had said that they were the Mayflower Pilgrims. They were those who became known as the Mayflower Pilgrims, but they hadn't yet themselves heard of the Mayflower.
Right.
And Scrooby's a little town in England where they gathered illegally to practice religion as they saw fit. And that got them in big trouble.
They were known as the separatists because they knew that we had to separate from the Church of England, as opposed to the Puritans who wanted to purify the Church of England. So this is the Scrooby Covenant that they wrote as they gathered illegally is it Northern England?
Mm-hmm.
In the small town in Northern England.
Not far from Robin Hood's house.
As ye Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in ye fellowship of ye gospel, to walk in all his ways, made known or to be made known to them, according to their best endeavor, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. So this is a God-based paradigm. It is okay, we're listening, we're acting, and we're putting our lives on the line. That's what these folks did, moms, dads, and kids in England in the late 1500s.
Well, this is 1606.
1606, yeah. Well,
so think about that, 1606, and the Mayflower arrived at the end of 1620. So yeah, this moved pretty quickly for its time.
Yeah, so King James I was an absolute monarch at the head of the Church of England. And when he found out what these folks were doing, he said, I will harry them out of the land, which ultimately he did. And they had to escape because they were persona non grata, treasonous beings in the late 1500s in England, early 1600s.
So here's a quick timeline, if you will, of the Pilgrim's journey, starting with that Scrooby Covenant in that little town. Connie and I have been there in England. They managed to get, it was hard, but they finally got out of England. They got themselves across to Leiden in Holland. Holland then, as today, was very liberal and there was religious freedom. So they find themselves in Leiden, where there's one of the best of the ancient universities, and the most educated and of the so-called pilgrims were Cambridge educated. They ended up teaching at Leiden University and having these major conferences going on then, because everything in Europe was shifting, especially around religion. You had Martin Luther himself, after whom Martin Luther King is named. You had John Calvin. So from the period of 1609 to 1620, and in 1620, they left Holland, sailed for America. The rest is literally history. Visions of a society based on freedom of conscience. And as they made landfall and were prepared to come ashore, it became clear that they really had to get a, what should we call it, an agreement, a compact among the, mostly the, I was going to say the men, and it's true, it was the men of the Mayflower who signed the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement that served them well, and it's now recognized as an early document of democracy. And then in 1621, and note that this is now 1622, so just a very few months ago, in 400 years ago, a very few months ago, they connected with the natives. The Massasoit was their leader, and they encountered this creator-based spirituality.
So, oops, wrong way.
Yeah.
So Martin Luther King says, put your faith in the nonconformists. And this is what the Pilgrims were known as, these separatists. They were known as nonconformists. And Martin Luther King says, the great creative insights have come from men who were in a minority. Men and women, shall we say? Dear Martin. It was the minority that fought for religious liberty. It was the minority that brought about the freedom of scientific research. In any cause that concerns the progress of mankind, put your faith in the nonconformists. And this was from a sermon he did called The Transformed Nonconformist. And I didn't put the date. I think it was in 15, I'm not sure.
Not 15.
No, 1957.
He's not that old.
Yeah, he's not that old. Sorry about that. I got my numbers messed up.
Yeah.
So
he was a 60s guy.
So here's a little visual that'll show you what we call the birth of the American mind, the first great synthesis. We have the Mayflower Compact, which we're going to go into the highlights of that. And that was in November of 1620, November 11th, mind you, 11/11. And the Poconoke Treaty, March 21st, the equinox.
Right on the spring equinox in 1621, when
so
they first met the natives. So many think that the natives welcomed them and fed them and housed them. Nope, they met them in March. And note, they arrived in November. They met the natives in March. That was 5 months later.
And that treaty lasted 54 years. And then in the fall, they had a great harvest celebration, thanks to Squanto teaching them how to plant Indian corn, because some of their crops didn't come up. And so they had a great, which we'll go into that.
And that, how about that? These two cultures living in peace and friendship for more than half a century.
Yeah, big deal, big deal.
Not easy.
And we'll go into the circumstances that led to that. And meanwhile, here's the Mayflower Compact. And we'll just go into these few, it was just one paragraph, and we've pulled out the essence of it. In the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. So they weren't only spiritual, they were forming a civil body politic, a government, to replace what the government in England was all about. For our better ordering and preservation, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So here we have the general good of the colony, equal and just laws, serving the common good and electing them.
And early constitutions, the
Yeah.
very seeds of a constitution right there.
Yeah, and this was a basis of their peace treaty with the Massasoit and the Pokanoket Wampanoags. So here we have just a quick timeline for you. Where do you want to just run through this just really quickly?
All right, so they made landfall on 9th of November, 1620. They drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact on the 11th of November, 1620. They had their first encounter with the natives, and it was rather violent, and a lot of arrows came flying through the air. Unfortunately, nobody was injured or killed
on either side.
December. And when they finally they'd slept on the beach overnight, and their muskets had got wet, and they couldn't get them to go off. And when they finally did, the Indians ran away. Nobody got hurt. They explored the coast and found a place that they thought would be good. It's a place that we call today Plymouth, Massachusetts, and is marked by the famous Plymouth Rock. And they landed, came ashore there on the 18th of December. So that was about a month and a half after they had arrived.
In a mini ice age.
It was freezing cold. They couldn't get, the ship couldn't get within a mile of the shore. It was so shallow, and their shallop couldn't get all the way in either. So they had to get in and wade in waist deep. So yeah, they came down with something called the general sickness. We think it was probably scurvy combined with maybe unfamiliar organisms, microorganisms in the water. And between December 1620 and March of 1621, fully half of the Mayflower Pilgrims died. And then in the spring, in comes this tall, beautiful Native American gentleman, and he reaches out to them and he says two words in the English language. He says, "Welcome, Englishmen." I think that's just extraordinary. And then he left. He came back 5 days later with the Massasoit, the local sagamore or chief, with as many as, I think it was 60 of his men and his brother. They crafted a treaty, a mutual protection treaty, if you like, and they honored, both sides honored that impeccably for the next half century. Amazing. And then to celebrate all of that in the fall of 1621, what we now think of as the first Thanksgiving, the 3-day harvest festivity.
So that's a quick run through. We'll go through more details. We're going to give you the context then and now. So there were pandemics. There was a regional pandemic called the Great Dying between 1616 and 1618. Note those dates. We're going to go into it in more detail. There was a local epidemic, which Andrew referenced, the general sickness with the Pilgrims. And the Great Dying was amongst the Native Americans.
And I might point out, if you don't mind,
yeah,
that no such thing as a regional pandemic. Pandemic means
okay.
global. It
okay.
literally was the final outburst of one of the greatest pandemics, literally a global disease epidemic that started in China, maybe in the 1100s, 1200s, finally made it across the Atlantic and took out the coastal Native Americans along the coast between the years 1616 and 1618. So,
yeah, we're going to it in more detail. And the local epidemic being the general sickness for the Pilgrims in the winter of 1620, 1621. And now we have a global pandemic.
And so this term pandemic is very well known.
It brings it right to us now. And the grief, loss, and transformation from those circumstances. So before New England, before the Mayflower, and this is the Great Dying of the Native people. And if you want to just touch on that quickly.
What?
Well, I guess you just did.
Sort of the print. Okay, so before the Mayflower arrived, what was going on in New England? There was a network of Native American confederacies, the Iroquois, the Massachusetts Federation that nobody's heard of, the Wampanoag, the Wabanaki, and more. This sort of somewhat flexible, ever-changing network that we have quite a reasonable understanding. And just before the Mayflower, there was an intertribal war that is known as the Tarleton's War that started in about 1607, finally ended the year before the Mayflower arrived, and it was over competition for the French fur trade between the people today known as the Micmac, who the Basque sailors called Tarratines. That's where the Tarratines War name came from. And between the Micmac and the Penobscot, two tribes that exist today up in northern New England. And that war spread to Massachusetts and took out this intertribal war, took out the coastal tribes. Now, think of it as a war, but the thing about this is that those warriors were carrying something they didn't know they were carrying. Hence the pandemic. They were carrying the plague. And as they came down here in this mission of war, they at the same time spread a disease. It's often thought it was smallpox. It was not smallpox. The first smallpox in New England was 1633.
And that everybody got. It wasn't any smallpox blankets or anything else. The white people, everybody got the smallpox. And actually the settlers took in the native people, the children and the people who were left behind from that smallpox in 1633.
You could look that up if you like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and here the Mayflower passengers, the first winter in 1620, 1621, the general sickness of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower who landed in Patuxet, Plymouth, because Patuxet was the first name, was the native name. On December 16, 1620, 51 survived the first winter of a debilitating scurvy and the effects of extremely cold temperatures and unfamiliar organisms in the water. 4 adult women, 14 adult men, and 34 children, ages 1 to 18 years, attended the 3-day harvest celebration in the fall of 1621 with 90 plus Native Americans. Squanto, who became their friend, was one of the few remaining Patuxet, having been taken as a slave in 1614 to Spain, and he spent several years in England and returned to New England after the pandemic to find his town and his people completely gone. So we're not going to go into that in any more detail because we got to keep moving. And now we have this global pandemic with over 5 million deaths worldwide. So we're taking it to bring it home as far as what a pandemic can do with the grief that leads to breakdown, that leads to rebirth and transformation. So we just want to give everyone heart that that's what we're in right now. We're in this process as a nation, as individuals, and so we hang in and we do our work and we get this job done. And this love, and I want to tell you that in the original writings of the Pilgrims, the word love is on every other page. And you're going to see that as we bring in some quotes of the Pilgrims. So love is a key factor. And as we all know, this word love is becoming more commonplace. We're opening our hearts, we're shifting frequencies, and we're bridging differences. We're in that process, and we're leading into a synthesis now, because we've just been talking about the first great synthesis. And here we have.
Here's Samoset welcoming the Englishmen. And Samoset was down in Plymouth from Maine. We actually know exactly where he lived because we have a friend who lives right on that property.
And they formed, right after Samoset came, he went and got the Massasoit, and they formed a mutual protection agreement on March 22nd, 1621, that led to 54 years of peace and friendship. And here's a beautiful drawing of that iconic time of meeting of cultures. And this is what Edward Winslow wrote about the Pilgrim Poconoke Treaty time. Our messenger made a speech unto him, the Massasoit, saying that King James saluted him with words of love and peace, and did accept of him as his friend and ally, and that our governor desired to see him and to truck with him, and to confirm a peace with him as his next neighbor. He liked well that speech and heard it attentively, though the interpreters did not well express it. After salutations, our governor kissed his hand, and the king kissed him, and so they sat down, Then they treated of peace. Now, is that lovely?
Starts right out with kissing. Now,
kissing.
So this picture is not what was going on because nobody's kissing. Look,
Nobody's
not even
kissing.
hugging. But what it
get
does
around
say
those big noses
is that chief signing executive order letting you stay in country. So fortunately, the executive order was signed, that were welcomed, and the rest
is
continues to be
history. And here's the Intercultural Harvest Feast, aka the first Thanksgiving, 3-day celebration in the fall of 1621. And this is a very accurate painting.
It's kind of
people by people, personality by personality. If you Google
everybody's
this
actually
painting,
identifiable there. Of the 51 surviving, we don't know the individual Native Americans,
natives, but
the
the chief guys are there at the table.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's great. And this is the only extant description of that 3-day harvest celebration written by Edward Winslow. Our harvests being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. They had to shoot off those muskets to keep them going. They did that monthly, I've heard. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. So there you have it. That's it, folks. That's the only description we have of that 3 days, and it's quite lovely.
And it was
and
actually
it's just
published
a plain party they had.
Yeah, and it was actually published. What's wonderful is they wrote this material, and the next ship took it back to London, where it was published, and it was incredibly popular. Everybody was fascinated back home in England.
I'm going to skip this one.
Okay,
we got to keep moving.
We have found the Indians. This
is cool, but it's part of our film. Insert Seeds of Freedom. We got to keep going. Oops, how do I get going? Here we go. So there was a spiritual alignment amongst these folks. And here it is. Here's a description. Further observing, and this is a quote from Edward Winslow, further observing us to crave a blessing on our meat before we did eat, and after to give thanks for the same, he asked us, what was the meaning of that ordinary custom? And they were staying with this gentleman named, this chief named Convergence. I told him that whatsoever good things we had, we received from God, as the author and giver thereof, and therefore craved his blessing upon what we had and were about to eat, that it might nourish and strengthen our bodies, and having eaten sufficient, being satisfied therewith, we again returned thanks to the same our God for that refreshing. This all of them concluded to be very well, and said they believed almost all the same things, and that the same power that we called God, they called Khitan. So, where there is love, there is no fear. After visiting with this chief combatant at his house, he demanded, how durst we, being but 2, come so far into the country? I answered, and this is Edward Winslow, where was true love, there was no fear, and mine heart was so upright towards them, that for mine own part I was fearless to come amongst them. There's that word love again. And here's Martin Luther King. Love brings miracles. And I found this handwritten note from Martin himself. Love is the greatest force in the universe. It is the heartbeat of the moral cosmos. He who loves is a participant in the being of God. Best wishes, Martin L. King Jr. And then he also says, in another Facing the Challenge of a New Age in 1956, he says, it is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. So we'll go on quickly. I don't know, we're not going to have much time to do this. This is the Great Migration in 1630. It's important for you to understand what was going on. Do you want to just run through that?
So in 1620,
Quickly.
of course, the Mayflower arrived and Plymouth Plantation was started in present-day Massachusetts. 10 years later, in 1630, the Puritans began to flee England and arrive in places like Cape Ann, Salem, and of course, Boston.
And the Church of England was persecuting dissidents with torture and imprisonment in
Yeah.
the 1620s,
was
and
going
the
on over
Pilgrims
there.
were long gone.
Right.
But what was going on for the Puritans was a big deal.
And then the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were still retaining, there was no separation of church and state. So the government control over religious matters was retained for quite some time.
Yeah, so they wanted to purify the church, but also keep their control over people's religious lives.
So in that decade between 1630 and 1640, an estimated 20,000 Puritans arrived in New England. So think about that and how that would have affected the balance with the local native
Yeah,
people
and then
as
this is
well.
realized in 1620 to 1630, the Pilgrim thing was happening. There were boats coming and things were happening in Connecticut and all around. And this
And
was
of
a
course,
huge shift.
the Dutch were in New York and the French were up north in present-day Canada, the Maritime provinces.
But what we want to bring in is Roger Williams. He was the founder of Rhode Island, and he was a radical separatist. He was a Puritan minister in the Church of England, threatened with persecution. So he escaped to America in 1631 in the first wave of the Great Migration. He challenges the Massachusetts Bay, Massachusetts Bay, their state domination over religious matters, because he's a separatist. He's like, we have the right to act according to our conscience and our religious beliefs. He champions freedom of conscience and religious freedom, and he champions the native rights to the land. He was very close with the Native Americans.
And he is a significant spiritual activist.
Yeah, that
See,
boy.
We've been looking through history at who stands out as spiritual activists who changed, who made a difference.
Yeah, so
And
this Roger Williams,
we're just learning about him.
yeah, and
He's really important.
he was disappointed with the Plymouth colony level of separation from Church of England. And he befriended the Poconokeets and the Narragansetts. And between 1636 and 1638, he founded the town of Providence. And in 1663, he obtained a charter for the colony of Rhode Island and becomes the governor of Rhode Island. So Rhode Island is huge in this process of the separation of church and state and freedom of conscience, and it hasn't gotten its due. So we want to bring that to the fore.
That little state in the East Coast.
Yeah. So how are we doing? We gotta, all right. We're gonna have to just skip through a little bit of this. So what happened is that the shifting frequencies, it went down in frequency, and ultimately violence replaced diplomacy, and Metacom, the son of Massasoit, declared war on the Pilgrims. They'd been preparing for war for many years, and that was a whole thing between the Pilgrims and the natives, because the Pilgrims knew they were preparing for war and were trying to mitigate it. And so it didn't work. And there was how many years of war? The bloodiest war.
It was only about 14 months.
14 months.
The actual war, but it was the bloodiest per capita conflict in recent American history. I'm aware of some earlier, but they were intertribal conflicts, not between the settlers and the Indians.
And this had to do with the pressure of all these settlers coming in, and the land and everything else. So some may say Philip was justified in the war. Others may say, well, if he hadn't, what would have happened if it hadn't been a war? But he lost the war. He was killed by an Indian, and his family were sold into slavery. And the Indian became the enemy and no longer the friend. And basically Native Americans disappeared from the history books at that time.
In New England.
In New England. And the Poconokeets, who the great peacemaker, Massasoit, was a Poconoket. His son was also a Poconoket. So the Poconokeets became persona non grata in New England. And they're just now coming forth with that peacemaker energy. So it's very exciting that the Pokanoket who were there with the pilgrims are coming forth with a peacemaker energy now. So that's very exciting. And the second great synthesis, because we talked about the first great synthesis with the Pilgrims and Indians and the 54 years of peace. And here's the second great synthesis with the great law influencing the US Constitution, with Ben Franklin with the Iroquois in the 1750s and the Iroquois at the Continental Congress in 1776. So that's a big deal. It's somewhat controversial. Some people think it's yes, some people say it's no, as far as the influence of the Iroquois, but it's quite obvious that it was a serious influence. So now we have a world out of balance and a global pandemic. And here's a quote attributed to Martin Luther King. I couldn't find it. It's optimism concerning divine nature. Don't get trapped by pessimism concerning human nature that is not balanced by an optimism concerning divine nature, or you will overlook the cure of grace. That's very beautiful. And if anybody knows that quote, please let me know the source, because I don't like to quote anything without the source. So here we have grief, breakdown, and rebirth leading to transformation as we speak. And we have love, faith, and trust, those attributes that Martin Luther King was talking about and bringing forth, and all the spiritual activists bring forth love, faith, and trust. And we've written a book called The Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm.
That's right.
And so we're bringing some tools forth for walking into this higher frequency, shifting frequencies, bridging differences through synthesis. So here we go. The third great synthesis. That's now. We get a new perspective, because the earth is moving into a higher frequency. There's more information available to us from this higher frequency. You can check in with Nassim Haramein and Resonance Science and Jude Currivan for this new science that's showing us that there's a new energy available. And we're in the midst of healing. We're accessing higher frequencies. There's no shame, blame, guilt, or anger ultimately for what we've done, because we've all been in a lower frequency. We've been reacting and responding to a lower frequency and building systems in a lower frequency. There's understanding and compassion happening now, listening to one another. We honor the humanity and divinity in all. We're going forward together, birthing a new way of being. So those are all attributes that Martin Luther King would say, yay, let's do it.
Yep. So don't read the news and listen to what Connie is saying. And Martin Luther King says, enter into the new world. Our ultimate goal is to create a beloved community. And this will require a quantitative change in our lives, as well as a qualitative change in our souls. We need to make a supreme effort to generate the readiness, indeed the eagerness, to enter into the new world which is now possible, the city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God.
Yay, Martin. So here we have a humanity and the evolutionary leap and the new science that's taking us forth. And the fully evolved human manifests the best features of all previous cultures.
We are part of nature, not above it, aware of the scientific perspective, yet not ruled by it, tuned into a higher reality, yet fully present in the world.
A synthesis occurs, which brings forth something that has never been on the planet before. So just know that we're not going back to anything. This is an evolutionary upward spiral. And we have what we call pan-indigenousness, the principles found in indigenous thought, the way of life of the native peoples of the Americas, and the essence of most tribal or traditional cultures throughout the world are principles which resonate to the deepest aspirations of all of humanity. This can be called pan-indigenousness, the common thread that ties the heart of humanity together in a vision of a world in balance. And we have you want to just run through this quickly?
Right. So an expanded paradigm, quantum mechanics, unified physics, Quantum reality illuminates and informs the Western paradigm, expands our understanding of the nature of the universe, which allows us to align with the indigenous worldview.
Oops, went backward.
Let's go that way.
So
Quantum entanglement, one of the elements of quantum science that is significant in terms of our evolutionary growth, the oneness of creation as we realize that how extraordinarily we are interconnected.
And entangled.
Mm-hmm.
And
the observer effect, how we influence by where we put our attention, how we influence the world, that the life that we experience. And it's a conscious universe. In fact, it's a conscious, loving universe.
yes, indeed. Now, you want to find out more about that? Get our book, The Trust Frequency, and our free ebook at thetrustfrequency.net. And here we have the indigenous worldview. And we'll just run through this. Respect and reverence for all of life.
Interrelatedness of all things and actions.
The co-creative power of thought.
Concern for future aspects of present action.
Living in balance.
Concern for the common good.
Trust in a higher power.
Incorporation of metaphysical into physical reality.
Equality in all aspects of life.
Sharing.
Cooperation. So we're accessing higher frequencies. We're going up in frequency, and everything has meaning. Everything's okay ultimately because we go beyond duality. That's a very big leap. And we're powerful. We trust. We understand the infinite balance of it all. And there's cooperation. So
and
there.
We are guided by the spiritual activists
yes.
throughout all of time. And I think on this very call right now, there are some spiritual activists.
Oops. Yes, and here we go.
Let's finish.
This is it. This is our concluding slide.
Ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, let me add Muslims there, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Here, let's hear it for freedom. And that's it, folks.
Here we are. Thank you.
So we thank you very much.
Wow.
We are thrilled.
Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. That's great. Thank you for getting it done. And you can stay in here a little more time. Rita's going to be the host. I'm going to go start another session, but that's magnificent life's work to share with everybody. There's probably a lot of questions people have about this and the implications and what does it all mean and where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Beautiful
So can
job.
we?
Yeah,
How long can we stay
We
and
can
have
stay
people
for-
do Q&A? That'd be great.
Yeah, you can keep the session going as long as you choose to.
Oh wow.
Rita's here and she's offered to, well, I asked and she agreed to be the host.
Thanks,
So
Rita.
wonderful.
So we'd love to have a Q&A. So that's great.
Okay, so you can do that. I'm going to leave to go help Fumi get what she's got going.
Okay.
Thanks, John. Love to summer.